Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today's discussion looks at a dramatic and provocative claim that has been circulating widely. A claim framed as a worst nightmare, a scenario for Iran's leadership. Instead of promoting violence or celebrating harm, this video breaks down what such language usually means, why it appears in media narratives, and how pressure, exposure, and accountability can become far more threatening to powerful figures than any single act of force. The phrase itself is designed to shock. It immediately creates urgency, fear, and curiosity. In political media, especially online, extreme wording is often used to describe moments when long-protected systems begin to crack under scrutiny, resistance, or internal failure. When people speak about a nightmare for Iran's supreme leadership, they are usually pointing to loss of control. Control over information, control over public narrative, control over loyal power structures that have enforced policies for decades. For years, Iran's ruling elite has relied on tightly managed institutions to maintain authority. Security forces, intelligence networks, and aligned militias have been presented as untouchable instruments of power. The idea that these mechanisms could be weakened is what truly generates fear at the top. The real threat is not a sudden dramatic strike, but a slow erosion of certainty. When loyalty becomes questionable and secrecy becomes impossible, even the most rigid systems begin to feel vulnerable. One major factor is global exposure. In the digital age, actions that were once hidden are now documented, shared, and analyzed in real time. Reports, videos, testimonies, and leaked documents travel across borders instantly. This level of visibility challenges the long-standing strategy of denial. When evidence accumulates and spreads, official narratives lose their effectiveness. The leadership is then forced into a defensive posture, constantly reacting instead of controlling the story. Another pressure point comes from within the region itself. Public frustration, economic hardship, and generational change have altered the political landscape. Younger populations are less influenced by fear and more connected to global conversations. These shifts do not always appear dramatic at first. They begin quietly, through dissent, questions, and refusal to accept old justifications. Over time, that quiet resistance becomes a force that cannot be easily silenced. International accountability mechanisms also play a critical role. Investigations, sanctions, travel restrictions, and legal actions may seem symbolic, but they send a powerful message. They signal that actions have consequences beyond national borders. For leaders accustomed to operating without challenge, this kind of scrutiny feels destabilizing. It limits diplomatic movement, strains alliances, and complicates economic survival. Another element often overlooked is internal power rivalry. Systems built on fear and loyalty are fragile because they depend on constant reinforcement. When cracks appear, factions begin positioning themselves for survival. History shows that authoritarian structures often weaken from internal competition rather than external pressure. When insiders fear being held responsible, trust erodes rapidly. The language of elimination in headlines is frequently metaphorical. It refers to the dismantling of influence, the collapse of credibility, or the neutralization of unchecked authority through law, exposure, and resistance. In this sense, the so-called butchers are not removed through violence, but through loss of legitimacy. Once legitimacy fades, power becomes unstable. Public perception matters more than ever. When citizens stop believing in official explanations, every action taken by the state is questioned. This creates a cycle of repression and backlash that accelerates decline. Economic strain intensifies this pressure. Sanctions, mismanagement, and isolation affect everyday life. When basic needs are threatened, ideological messaging loses its power. Leaders may attempt to respond with stronger rhetoric or harsher measures, but history suggests that such responses often backfire. Fear can control behavior temporarily, but it cannot restore trust. Another important aspect is the role of diaspora communities. Voices outside the country are harder to silence and often play a key role in shaping international opinion. Their advocacy keeps issues alive long after headlines fade. Media literacy has also improved among global audiences. viewers are more aware of propaganda techniques and more skeptical of one-sided narratives. This awareness reduces the effectiveness of state-controlled messaging. The idea of a surprise in this context usually refers to unexpected unity. When different groups, institutions, or countries align around accountability, it catches entrenched powers off guard. No single event causes collapse. It is the accumulation of pressures, mistakes, and resistance that leads to irreversible change. For Iran's leadership, the true nightmare is unpredictability. Not knowing which narrative will break next, not knowing which ally may distance itself, not knowing which internal actor may prioritize self-preservation over loyalty. This uncertainty forces constant vigilance, which drains resources and focus. Governing becomes reactive rather than strategic. It is also important to clarify that discussing these dynamics does not mean endorsing violence. Real change that lasts is built through lawful pressure, documentation, international cooperation, and the resilience of civil society. Violence often strengthens hardliners by justifying repression. Accountability, on the other hand, weakens them by removing excuses. When institutions are exposed to the same rules as everyone else, their mystique disappears. Power thrives on distance and fear, not transparency. Another layer of this conversation involves information warfare. Competing narratives battle for attention online. While some exaggerate for clicks, others attempt to minimize serious issues. Viewers must learn to distinguish between emotional headlines and substantive analysis. Understanding the mechanics of power is more valuable than reacting to shock phrases. The long-term trajectory of any political system depends on adaptability. Systems that refuse to reform often face the harshest outcomes, not because of enemies, but because of their own rigidity. In Iran's case, the challenge is balancing authority with legitimacy in a world that demands accountability. Ignoring that reality increases isolation. When people talk about fear at the top, they are often describing the fear of irrelevance, the fear that control mechanisms no longer work as intended. Once that realization sets in, every decision becomes heavier, every move risks accelerating decline. This is why symbolic actions, like public criticism from former allies or unexpected legal developments, resonate so strongly. They suggest that the shield of impunity is thinning. Change does not announce itself with certainty. It appears as confusion, contradiction, and overreaction. The more aggressively leaders attempt to project strength, the more visible their insecurity can become. Understanding this context helps viewers see beyond sensational language. It reframes the conversation from fantasy scenarios to real political processes. True accountability is slow, complex, and often frustrating. But it is also far more transformative than sudden acts of destruction. As history has shown across many nations, systems that rely on fear eventually confront the limits of that strategy. When citizens, institutions, and the international community converge around shared standards, even the most entrenched power structures feel the pressure. That pressure is the real nightmare, not because it is dramatic, but because it is relentless. It does not disappear after a headline fades. It grows quietly, feeding on documentation, memory, and persistence. In the end, the future of any country depends on how it responds to this pressure. Adaptation can lead to stability. Resistance to change often leads elsewhere. This conversation is not about celebrating harm. It is about understanding power, accountability, and the forces that shape political change. By looking beyond shock titles, we gain clearer insight into what truly unsettles authoritarian systems, and that insight is far more valuable than fear itself.